This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can join our conversation at our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter today at WNPR Wheelhouse. As a matter of fact, on Facebook, we're on Facebook Live today, so you can see us live and catch that later on. We're also here with CTN, the Connecticut network. For some reason, we've got all these cameras pointing at a radio show, so we're very excited today. And as always, we've got in Colin McEnroe. He's the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Howdy, Colin.
I'm not only on this show, but I'm on Alex Bergstein's new variety show on CTN. Today I'll be doing
really?
A few sketch comedy bits.
We'll be looking forward to that later on today. More great programming on CTN. Also joining us today for the very first time, making her Wheelhouse debut, Ryan Lindsay, reporter covering gun issues for Connecticut Public Radio and the Guns and America Project. Hello there, Ryan.
Hey.
And Mark Pazniokis. He's Capitol Bureau Chief at the Connecticut Mirror. Hello there, Paz.
Good morning.
Well, look, we do like to spend a lot of time on the program, perhaps poking fun at the news, and there is an awful lot of news to poke fun at. This last week has not seemed particularly cheery. We started talking with Ryan Lindsay, our guns reporter, last week because there are so many gun bills right now percolating at the state capitol, and we are going to get to those. But since that initial conversation, we had a couple different things happen. The Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated a wrongful death lawsuit by the families of 9 victims of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting against Remington Arms. More on that. And I think, obviously, bigger news for this week, Colin. 50 people were killed in last Friday's attacks on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. The Prime Minister there is vowing to pass gun law reforms. Let's just start there. We turn on the news almost every day, seemingly, in America and hear about another mass shooting of some sort. This is happening in a different place with different laws, in some ways a long way away, but we're feeling kind of close to it this week.
One thing you don't even have to look up in these situations is whether or not this country has stronger gun laws than the United States, because every developed country has stronger gun laws than the United States. You also don't have to look up whether their gun homicide rate is higher, because nobody's is. In the case of New Zealand, their gun homicide rate was extremely low, despite having kind of patchy gun laws that, as their prime minister has made clear, need to be tightened up. But their gun homicide rate was so low that this horrible tragedy at Christchurch was the equivalent of 6 years of gun homicides in New Zealand under their normal rate. So, yeah, this is a place where this kind of thing is much more of an anomaly than it is here in the United States. But again, that's true of everywhere. So there's a lot to unpack here. We need to talk about laws. We need to talk also about culture. You can change the laws. If you don't change the culture, you haven't solved the problem. And the reverse is true, too. I mean, one of the things we've learned here in Connecticut is changing the laws does matter. It has the reverse effect of resulting in some wild stockpiling as the law is about to go into effect. But in general, in terms of lowering gun homicides and gun suicides, Connecticut's tighter than average gun laws seem really to help, seem really to have an effect. So I don't know. This conversation can go so many places. I'm just going to pass the baton.
Well, as I pass the baton to you, Ryan, I guess I'm wondering what you're making of this, given that you and your colleagues are covering guns across America. That gun culture, indeed, a really interesting story on NPR last night by Rob Schmitz. And it was unpacking the notion that New Zealand is not a country that doesn't have guns. There's lots of guns. It's a wild place. It's the place, famously where J.R. Tolkien novels are filmed, because it looks like a place where you might have to arm yourself. But people are really coming to a reckoning with guns there. What are you making of this news this week?
It's challenging because there are people whose livelihoods are tied to having access to a weapon, especially hunters and farmers. Even here in the States, that's important for them to be able to defend their herd. There's a piece out of one of our partner stations with Guns in America that talks about that. When you look at a gun, what do you see? And it's a family who they have a farm, and that's important, whether it's coyotes, mountain lions. And so it's challenging to look at a country where, like you said, there is this reckoning because there was such a dramatic loss of life in such an awful fashion. And so I think that it's something that, as we've heard, they're considering very cautiously and carefully, not trying to jump too quickly to sort of make a very reactive and perhaps sort of reactive law that wouldn't really address the problem at hand. And I think what a lot of people are pointing out is the problem at hand is this growing white nationalism and growing white supremacy and these acts of homegrown terrorism that are really taking a lot of lives. Not so much the fact that people have access to guns. Because when you think about it, especially here in the United States, these mass shootings are very rare. They are known to cause a lot of public concern and hysteria, but regular shootings like homicides, things like that with handguns happen far more often than mass shootings and those type of AR-15 rifles and the large guns that we see having been used in Parkland, in Vegas, in other places.
Yeah, and Paz, I mean, and we'll touch on this, but I think Ryan makes the important point. This is a story that's layered in a couple different ways. Obviously, as we're going to hear from in a moment, the Prime Minister of New Zealand is pushing for tougher gun laws. But this is also clearly a white nationalist act of terrorism that has drawn in white nationalists from around the globe, actually, in his manifesto. It also took place at two places of worship. When it happens at mosques, there's the other overlay of the way that not just America, New Zealand, but the rest of the world views Islam. I guess I'm wondering which of these threads to pull out right now, but there's so many of them specifically around this terrible tragedy.
Well, before we get to the role of white nationalism and how that came up in Connecticut recently at a vigil at a mosque, and there was a lot of criticism for President Trump's unwillingness to directly confront that question. But on the gun issue, I mean, one of the big differences between how the United States deals with guns and how, for example, how Australia reacted after a horrific shooting years ago. The former Prime Minister of Australia was actually in Hartford the other day at a Connecticut forum. And one of the questions from the audience was, how did you deal with that awful tragedy? And she said, well, we passed a law that it severely restricts gun ownership in Australia. And the crowd applauded, fine. But there's a cultural and legal difference in the United States. The Second Amendment to the Constitution. We debated for more than 100 years what the Second Amendment meant. About the right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia. But the United States Supreme Court, in the Heller decision, has interpreted that clearly that it means the private right of ownership of handguns in America. So the debate continues, but that's an essential part of this debate. There is the constitutional right, and then there's the cultural issue that arises in part, I think, from that. For the gun owners, the Second Amendment, it's almost there's a religious fervor about it, and we saw that at the General Assembly recently in public hearings over 4 bills that in the scheme of gun control, they were relatively minor proposals. But because of the symbolism, one was to allow the police to, if the cop sees someone with a gun in their waistband, to be able to legally ask, sir, do you have a carry permit? Because right now there's no right to do that, and the police, they can ask, but the person with the gun doesn't have to show it.
Well, and let's actually go there, Ryan, for a second. You and I were talking about this bill, and we'll lay out maybe some of the others. But this is one that has to do with the right to carry a weapon in full view, and given the instances that we've seen around the world, including this one, there is quite some fear amongst an awful lot of people when they see anybody with a gun. They're wondering, what exactly is that all about? And as Paz put out, there's quite a bit of fervor behind it. A lot of people are very passionate about this issue.
Definitely. I think there's a clash of culture was one of the takeaways, is that in communities where gun ownership and carrying your guns in the broad daylight is a thing, is normal, there's generally not that much fear. But there was a police chief who said if someone's at a state fair and they're carrying their gun, there's some people at that state fair who are going to be like, yeah, that's totally normal, and other people who are going to be incredibly frightened. So one of the bottom lines is that not everybody is comfortable seeing a gun in public, especially, police for one thing, but beyond that, just a civilian. But from people who love their guns, those folks were concerned about this bill in particular being a breach of their Fourth Amendment rights, particular unreasonable search and seizure. What a couple of the police chiefs who were actually there at the hearing expressed was that this is no way a bill that they would want to use to try and detain people, right? It's just, if you see somebody with a gun, then you simply walk up to them, hey, sir or madam, can I see your permit? And if they have it, which, assuming they're a lawful gun owner, they will show that, and that's about it.
And by the way, we should say, most people with carry permits, if they're stopped by a police officer and they have a gun on their waist, the first thing they do is say, "Officer, I want you to know I have a pistol in a holster in my right hip, and I have a carry permit in my wallet. Would you like to see that permit now?" And because that's just safety. That's But then there's the issue that Ryan referred to. It's what constitutes unreasonable search. What is it may be even the briefest of interactions. And the police chief she's referring to has testified. One of them, the chief of Guilford, he said it's a 30-second interaction. And it's like, okay, fine, you have a carry permit, sir. Thank you very much. Go on your way.
But it does point out, Colin, that in a case like this, and actually in a lot of the cases having to do with guns and gun culture, what guns you should be able to carry, whether it has to do with magazine capacity or caliber of weapons, an awful lot of police are on the opposite side of an awful lot of other people who carry guns on this because they feel in fear.
Yeah, and Pat said an important thing too, which is that the majority of people who have carry permits would be willing to cooperate with something like that, and are willing to cooperate with something like that. I think it's important to note the people who show up at the Capitol for hearings on the gun-loving side of this equation, they not only don't represent the electorate or the citizenry of Connecticut in general. I don't think they even really represent very accurately gun owners. I think most gun owners are more moderated in their stances. I mean, in terms of the Fourth Amendment issue here, look, the police can ask for your driver's license and your registration. That is not considered a search of your car. They're just asking, they want to see whether you get a driver's license or not and where it is right now. So I don't think that holds water particularly well. I mean, the concern you have about that particular law is profiling. You get sort of closer to stop and frisk, which doesn't have the world's greatest reputation. So who gets asked that question? But I also think you can always, in all of these cases where there are objections, you can try at least to write a law which addresses the objections. That's what law writing is kind of all about. So, most of the things that are working their way through the General Assembly seem like pretty reasonable to me. I don't know how many of them can be passed. I do want to say one thing because I don't want it to slip by. I think the gun issue is getting more and more like climate change in the sense that a new younger generation is tired of watching us blunder around and not solve a problem, in this case that costs lives. I happened to be teaching undergraduates at the time that Parkland happened and the post-Parkland movement started. And from that point on, it was the most interesting thing to my college undergraduates. Nothing else that happened for the rest of that spring rose to that level of engagement. And I think the combination of what you've seen with that kind of movement. Watch, there will be a movement like that in New Zealand. I can almost guarantee you that young people are going to come forward and say, this can't happen anymore. They are better than we are somehow at activating these kinds of issues. I think the combination of those people and the Sandy Hook parents, who we're going to talk about in a second, represent a cultural change, a group of people who are basically not taking no for an answer, even though they get no for an answer a lot of the time.
Ryan, you want to pick up?
Yeah, and I think it was interesting to have the racial profiling argument brought up from the Republican side. There were two legislators in particular, and I thought that it was a bit of a reach because, again, this bill is not like – if these crimes that are happening, people have handguns. So you're not walking around your neighborhood with a large rifle because that's just a dead giveaway. And so that was something that felt a little sort of out of pocket or a stretch because – and then the example that they focused on was a store clerk in a Subway in Bridgeport. And the store clerk called the police because a man was in there with his gun visible. And so that's something that can happen, but with this law in place could just simply address that situation. And from what I heard, they handled that situation pretty well. But both of those store clerks were black, which kind of like poked holes in what in what they were saying. And I don't think, again, this is like meant to target if we're seeing someone outside with a gun, we have a concern. It's sort of like a very simple application of ask, like if you get pulled over for driving your car recklessly, hey, do you have a license? Are you drunk? Like
it is, however, though, fair to say that black people in America carrying guns or not carrying guns tend to be treated differently by law enforcement and others than people who are not black.
Oh, absolutely. That's not a question.
That's just not a question
That's
at hand.
a reality.
And it's unfortunately one of those things that sort of gets skirted over whenever we have conversations like this at the Capitol. Yeah.
And there's another element of the question of must you show a permit? When it happens because a police officer or someone else sees someone with a gun and they rightfully want to know, okay, what's the deal? There's that. And then there are people who are making a point and they want to be provocative. And one of these incidents, the one in Bridgeport, that seemed to be the case, that this person said, no, damn it, I have a right to carry. And no, I don't have to show you my permit. There was somebody who was arrested for breach of peace in a movie theater in New Haven after the Aurora theater shooting. And he was in a theater by himself in a midnight showing. He let all these people know he had a gun. Somebody called the police. It was right after Aurora, after a shooting in a movie theater. And, there was an argument about whether or not he had a right to have the gun there and show it. But the sense of the police officer was he was being provocative. He was trying to make a political point. And, when you're dealing with firearms, misunderstandings can occur at midnight in a dark movie theater if you have a gun.
Well, let's actually move to a couple other pieces of legislation quickly since we're talking about this. The two other ones that you wanted to talk about, Ryan, that I think are interesting, one has to do with the storage of firearms, and the other one has to do with something we started talking about last legislative session, so-called ghost guns. Maybe you can start with storage of firearms. What's new in legislation right now?
In terms of the storage of firearm, a lot of that comes in the wake of Ethan Song's death. He was a 15-year-old who accidentally shot and killed himself in Guilford last January. And so the current legislation did not allow his family to pursue any sort of legal action when it came to the owner of the gun, the young man's father. And so because it was loaded, right, or the word loaded is in the bill. And so that's something obviously very hard to figure out or to, decipher once someone is dead, right? Because what happened if you have the bullets, the gun, and the lock and the keys all in the same box or same vicinity, then a lot can go wrong. And so what this bill does is raise the age of minor from 16 to 18. And then it also removes that clause with the language around loaded. So basically it's just saying if you have a firearm in the home with a minor, and that minor being 18 instead of 16, then there's a certain way that you must store it in order to hopefully prevent that type of thing from happening, but also to address one of the things that didn't come up but is very prevalent as well is suicide in homes, regardless of the age of the person, is something that's very prevalent that also gets glazed over in these type of public hearings.
And Colin, you wanted to talk a little bit about this because this is one of those bills that's come up a little bit in the course of the last couple of years.
Right, although the point that Ryan just made is a really important one. I mean, actually, gun suicides are a bigger problem, I believe, than gun homicides.
By a long shot.
By a long shot. So making the gun not available to the person in the house who may be going through, an impulsive, depressive moment is really, really important. This strikes me as a bill that could pass. Paz may have tried to do some nose counting at this point and may have some sense of whether that's true or not. But it seems that, first of all, it has a storyline with it. It has the Ethan Song story, which it pulls it out of the realm of the abstract and into the world of real people. It also seems not unreasonable. I know that people are going to have a problem. They want to be able to lay their hands on their gun very quickly if there's an intruder. But once again, it seems to me that the damage done by guns lying around or too easily accessible or not securely stored far outweighs the harm that would be done by this notion that you got to get your hand on the gun really fast so you can shoot this burglar.
Is this something that has a chance of passage?
Some version of that, I think, will pass. The question, there's two things, and Ryan touched on the more complicated of the two, which is the questions of liability, and that always gets more of a debate. But the actual storage issue, this is an incredibly minor change in the current law. And most of the legislators, whether they were pro-gun or pro-gun control, assumed that storage law applied to the firearm, whether or not it was loaded, because as you pointed out, if there's ammunition nearby, then come on. I mean, that was the issue here. Well, they cannot prove that the gun was loaded, so therefore it did not have to be stored in the way that the law now requires. So that's again, that's a relatively minor ask at the General Assembly right now.
In that other bill having to do with ghost guns, this is a conversation you and I were having beforehand, Ryan, trying to figure out what exactly qualifies as a ghost gun, because the notion is that we want to keep people from 3D printing some gun by themselves that has never been made anyplace and doesn't have any sort of a serial number, but it's a little bit broader than that.
Yeah, so my understanding of ghost guns, in addition to ones that can be made by 3D printers, is essentially any gun that can be made that doesn't have a serial number. So if you're a person who enjoys building guns in the privacy of your home, technically you are creating ghost guns. If you are a gun shop who maybe is building guns, like the law requires you to put serial numbers on them so they're not ghost guns. And so any type of gun without a serial number, basically anything that the police cannot track, figure out where it came from, who purchased it, and follow the gun trace, which is helpful in some instances in solving crimes. If it does not have that piece of information, it's considered a ghost gun.
Yeah, and I don't know, Colin, are we, in bills like this, are we solving problems that have yet to exist, or are we actually closing loopholes on existing problems?
I would say the latter. And look, I mean, if you look around the world, registration of firearms is an effective technique in lowering gun homicide rates. Permit to purchase, like we have in Connecticut, also a great way to lower those rates. But this is a loophole, and so there are people coming to the hearing and testify and say, "Well, I'm retiring soon, and then I wanted to take up making guns as a hobby." Well, fine. We need to set up then a registering process for that among other things creates a serial number. So we have some. I mean, we theoretically know, to go back to cars for a second, where every car in America belongs. Every car, I mean, I don't think as many of them are in Delaware as are reflected in certain amounts of paperwork, but there's at least a theoretical paper trail to where every car goes. Every car has a theoretical home and some paperwork to go along with it. There's no reason we can't do that with guns, and I think this law can be written so that it does that. Now, Paz is sitting there thinking, yeah, but then there'll have to be somebody who's in charge of all that, which means there'll be a fiscal note attached to the law, which is going to cause all kinds of problems. Because the minute you have a law that costs something to enforce, that you might have to even hire, God forbid, a couple of full-time employees to deal with, you're in a whole new realm.
What I'm going to do is let me take a break. We've got one more gun topic to tackle that happened last week. Again, the Supreme Court ruling at the Connecticut level. And then there's some other issues that perhaps don't have fiscal notes attached, but they're still being debated at the state capitol, and an awful lot of people are spending a lot of time debating them. Colin McEnroe is here, host of The Colin McEnroe Show. Ryan Lindsay is a reporter who covers gun issues for Connecticut Public Radio and Guns in America. Mark Pasniokis is Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror, and this is The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky, talking about the week's news at WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook Live today at WNPR Wheelhouse, also on Twitter at the same handle. Joining us in studio, Mark Pasniokis, Capitol Bureau Chief at the Connecticut Mirror, who tweets at CT Mirror Paz. Ryan Lindsay, who covers gun issues for Connecticut Public Radio at R. Lindsay Reports. And Colin McEnroe is here. He's the host of The Colin McEnroe Show. He's just at Colin McEnroe. But you've also got a show this afternoon, Colin. What's on your show?
Well, The Colin McEnroe Show is a little bit more of a mess than usual. Like, as an entity right now, I've been struggling with back problems all week. Meanwhile, one of my producers, Jonathan McNichol, has welcomed a new McNichol into the world.
Yay! Congratulations,
young Simon.
McPants. Yes.
They were between Simon and Garfunkel. They went with Simon. I think that was a good idea. So, and this happened a little earlier. We had a plan for all this because he'll be on paternity leave, but it happened a little earlier. So we're going to put in, and it's sort of in honor of Robert Kennedy Jr., whom we'll be talking about in just a second, and the terrific This American Life segment that ran last week, apropos of our gun conversation, about the way that Alex Jones and some of his followers have tormented, in particular, one of the Sandy Hook fathers. We're going to do our show. We're going to rerun our show about people who believe the Earth is flat, of which there are more than you might think. All these people who kind of depart. I do want to just quickly promote forward towards every year. We do a show right at the beginning of March Madness where Julia Pistel, the leader of CT Improv, or a leader of CT Improv Comedy, and Bill Curry get together as our basketball analysts. And also every year we have the president of Wofford College, if Wofford is anywhere in the draw. And this is a big year for Wofford. And this year also, because of the presence of the basketball at the XL Center, Frankie Graziano, AccuFrankie, will be broadcasting to us or joining us from the XL Center.
So this is a big show. Wofford's like a 7-seat or something.
They're a 7-seat. Yeah.
My goodness. So that's coming up soon. Lots to look forward to on the Colin McEnroe Show. We're going to get back to this issue at hand. Day before the New Zealand massacre, we were talking about at the top of the show, the Connecticut Supreme Court cleared the way for families of some of those killed in the Sandy Hook shooting to take on Remington. They're the makers of the Bushmaster rifle that was used in the Sandy Hook shootings. Here's Bill Sherlock, one of the litigants. His wife, Mary, was a Sandy Hook school psychologist who was killed that day.
What I'm looking to find out in this whole process, essentially, is what went on inside. What went on inside Remington? Let's see the internal documents, the internal emails, as to what the charges were to their marketing and ad execs.
So, Ryan Lindsay, you've been following this really closely, and this is really important. So, whether or not this lawsuit ever turns into money coming from Remington to these families, what he's looking at and what these families are looking at is the ability to go inside and learn more about how exactly this company marketed its weapons.
Yes, it could mark a very significant shift in peeling back of layers of these corporate entities that produce things that people buy to then, do a lot of things that causes a lot of pain. And so with this, similar, there was a likening to what was done with big tobacco companies in terms of having them release documents, or forcing them, I should say, to release documents that show that there were specific targeting of Black communities in terms of Newport and Lorillard, targeting of youth under the age of 18, because if you get hooked at a young age, you're less likely to be able to quit or become a lifelong smoker. And also the targeting of women, you think about Virginia Slims. So these things are done very intentionally. And a lot of the marketing that they pointed to were ads with Remington and Bushmaster about linked to hypermasculinity, language that would suggest that there's some sort of need to take down your adversaries. And these, again, are not in military settings. These are not in combat settings, but speak to a particular demographic of people where there is an attraction to that notion, to that idea of being an armed civilian with a weapon that generally is just used in military settings.
So it's a military weapon, Paz, that's marketed to a civilian population, a young civilian population, and Remington was not the only company doing this.
Yeah. It's not exactly a military weapon. Let's be clear here, because the gun people will jump on us, and rightly so. It's a military-styled weapon.
Yes.
It has military.
Let's just pull that apart.
No,
then,
but
though.
I will.
Yeah.
I will. But
I think that's important.
The
Yes.
the AR-15 is many times it's referred to as a semi-automatic version of the M16 and other military, and it's sort of broader than that now. And just real quickly, I mean, a true assault weapon is capable of single-shot fire, burst fire, and fully automatic fire. There's a selector switch. All right, so that's the mechanics of it, and it's an important distinction. What is available to the civilian market is a semi-automatic version that looks like it's a cool weapon. They're called black weapons, and to this marketing idea, the question is, who did they think would be attracted by the pitch that they look like military weapons? You can say, well, a semi-automatic weapon is a semi-automatic weapon as far as how it functions. The difference with these is, they can accept large capacity magazines. And as we saw at Sandy Hook, you can fire 150 rounds very quickly and kill 26 human beings in less than 4.5 minutes. But so they're trying to find out what's the appeal. What did these people know? And the legal theory it's a little novel. It's this concept called negligent entrustment. And what all that means is there a common law claim of negligence that these companies were wrongly, recklessly entrusting these weapons that don't belong in a civilian market to people who may be disturbed or what have you. So, I mean, that's sort of the door they're trying to open here with the marketing material.
And to my understanding, that negligent entrustment claim actually was rejected by the court. What they did zero in on was this one CUPTA, so the Connecticut Unfair Trade Protections Act. Right. But specifically, they said that Connecticut law does not permit advertisements that promote or encourage violent criminal behavior. And so, again, as you were saying, that's what they're really looking to dig into is who was the intended audience, what type of marketing and advertising were they used to attract a particular demographic, and also why?
Yeah, and that's why, and Colin, that negligent entrustment idea is the part that gets it what Paz and a lot of other gun owners would say right away, which is...
Wait a minute, Paz is a gun owner?
No. What Paz said to me, and so what other gun owners might well say, which is this isn't a military weapon, but this is a military-style weapon. This is really going after the way this thing looks.
And we have to quickly note that there's a very strong federal law that provides a liability immunity. So that's why this is a national story. This is a crack in that armor, and the question is, will it survive? Will it go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and will it survive a challenge there?
Right. Unlikely it does survive a challenge there because of that 2005 law, which the gun lobby pushed through. It's an incredible shield law that shouldn't have been passed and does inhibit our ability. I mean, another interesting analogy would be to opioids. We are now getting very curious about how opioids are marketed, how they became so pervasive, what sort of techniques were used to introduce them to the market right now. So I do agree with Mr. Sherlock. I think discovery is hell for the people who do this kind of stuff. The discovery process, which will go forward, I would assume, will be really, really interesting and very unpleasant for Remington. And bravo, Connecticut Supreme Court. It was a squeaker, too. It was 4-3. I haven't had a chance to read any of the decisions yet, but I will. I'm interested.
I want to turn to another topic, since we're talking about things that get people very, very riled up, Paz. Well, why don't we talk about whether or not children should be forced to be vaccinated in Connecticut schools? This is a really important issue. It's a big issue that's come to the Capitol. Again, this is being debated across the country, and maybe you can tell us what exactly you've been seeing at the Capitol surrounding bills on vaccinations.
Okay, the issue in Connecticut right now is whether or not a religious exemption for vaccines, which is there are only two ways a parent can refuse to have their child vaccinated before going to public schools. One is a medical exemption because your child's immune system is compromised in some way. It would be unsafe. And the other is a religious exemption. Now, the major religions don't have problems with vaccines. I mean, I think the Dutch Reformed Church has some issues. So what these parents are really talking about is a personal choice that they believe they should be able to make. Now, the science is overwhelmingly in favor of the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Is there risk to any vaccine? Yes, there are. There are risks. There are certainly known side effects. But the science of it is you weigh that risk against the benefit of eradicating polio, eradicating measles. I'm of an age where some of these vaccines were not available. I think rubella was one that didn't come out until the late 60s, and I grew up with somebody who was deaf as a result of contracting rubella. So, for somebody who's 60, 61, that's a real thing. So at the Capitol, it's a small population that's very well organized thanks to the web. And I've talked to a lot of these parents, and they believe it's their right, and they believe that in this day and age, it's unnecessary. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. was up here beating that drum. He did a long presentation. He was supposed to be part of a roundtable discussion with a pediatrician and some Yale scientists, and ultimately, the American Academy of Pediatricians, they don't want anything to do with Bobby Kennedy. They say it's not a debate. There's nothing to debate. This is well settled that this was going to be a sideshow, so they opted out.
So they opted out of this.
I just think it's interesting the focus on these particular vaccines. Flu is very common, obviously far more common, measles, mumps, polio, malaria, et cetera. And so that's something that is not mandatory. I've never had a flu vaccine. And then also I remember when the HPV vaccine came about, it's not mandatory for women. It can be suggested. But again, I think the ability to choose for yourself or choose for your children does matter. But it is interesting to kind of see this sort of focus on these particular vaccines.
Yeah,
Well, the one reason flu is more common than those other diseases is that most of those other diseases were essentially eradicated by a public vaccination program, which is now under challenge. So you're starting to have outbreaks of these previously eradicated diseases, which is incredibly dangerous. You're not just choosing for yourself. You're choosing for everybody who comes into contact with your kids. And the people who are at the highest risk are babies, because there are a lot of diseases for which you cannot vaccinate until a child reaches a certain age. So babies become an unvaccinated population that is dependent on the parents of some of the older kids to create a wall of immunity through vaccination. I don't think this is a matter of personal choice at all. This is, as past suggested, settled science. There's no reason for this. It's dangerous to little babies. And when we have these outbreaks, it's incredible. We have an overstretched public health system as it is. And to deal with an outbreak, which involves quarantining and all kinds of other measures, is a huge strain on the existing infrastructure.
Yeah, and outbreaks like this, they're not just theory paths. I mean, very recently, just in Oregon, Washington State, this is something that has been happening.
We have good friends who have a 4-month-old grandchild in Oregon in an area where there is currently a measles outbreak, and they're very wary about where they can take that 4-month-old because that baby can't be vaccinated against measles until you're a year old. So it's that's a real world concern. Now some of these, HPV, for example, that's not communicable in the same way. So, I think you can have reasonable discussions, pushing back a little bit, and those discussions include the aggressive schedule for some of these things. But that's a nuanced thing, and that's something you should have in conversation with your pediatrician and your doctor. Seth Mukin has this great book called The Panic Virus, and it opens with this chilling anecdote of a child who has this disease and they can't tell what it is, and finally an older doctor who had seen it because he was old enough to see patients before the Hib vaccine. But these parents had listened to their chiropractor, not their pediatrician, on whether or not that vaccine was safe.
I want to turn to another. Since we're tackling these fun issues, Colin, this year supporters of the Aid in Dying legislation no longer up against opposition from the Connecticut State Medical Society. The organization has decided to remain neutral on this issue. This is another piece of legislation that we've sort of seen kicking around the state capitol. Does anything change this year in terms of people's ability to perhaps provide comfort at the end of life to a loved one?
This is a really tough issue in Connecticut. So there's two groups of people who've traditionally been worried about it. As you say, one group of people were doctors. Doctors didn't necessarily know whether they wanted to be involved in this way. But the other group of people are, again, religious people, typically Roman Catholic people. That's probably the largest. The Roman Catholic Church has opposed the Roman Catholic Church in the 1970s and I think into the 80s lobbied against even advanced directives, the kind of thing that basically everybody's supposed to have right now. They didn't think that. They thought that was kind of an unholy usurpation of God's role in either creating or ending life. So I would say the neutral position of the physicians probably helps this along a little bit. But it's still going to run into, and is already running into, a tremendous amount of pushback from this other group. I don't know that it gets passed. I don't know. What do you probably have once again a nose count a little bit, or
go quickly, Kaz.
No, but it's the disabled community. I mean, the people who have been marginalized their whole lives, who you can understand the distrust of society looking at them saying, should we preserve them, and so you understand that, so they're pitted against people who've always felt in charge of their lives, who are confident that their families will make the right decision at that moment, versus people who have had to struggle, who have always felt they're on the margins of society.
And that's something that Nicole Leonard, she spent some time during the public hearing, and there was a disability rights activist who is in a wheelchair and expressed that concern is that it's not so much they don't view it as assisted suicide. Their fear is linked to that discrimination and that sort of systemic problem in treatment or maltreatment, I should say, from doctors, where those doctors don't necessarily prioritize or value their quality of life and their ability to choose, even while dealing with particularly challenged disabilities. And then on the flip side, Nicole talked about there's a woman who has cancer that's spread to her brain, and she can't actually, if she wanted to use aid in dying, she'd have to move out of state. And so that's something that this woman expressed a lot of frustration with, is that I built my life here, my family is here, but the bottom line is that this cancer is coming for my brain, and I might not have that long to live. And so I want to have the right to choose, but as it stands now, she would have to go out of state to do so.
I know we got a clock problem. Could I just say one more thing
please
about
do.
this? So yesterday, where we lived, did a terrific show. Lucy did a terrific show about Alzheimer's disease. And at one point, there was a husband of an Alzheimer's patient who talked about his wife's initial diagnosis. And when she found out, when she was finally diagnosed, she said, I'm going to take German lessons. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Life is short. I'm going to cram in a lot of things that I wasn't able to do. The first person Jack Kevorkian ever killed, I think her name was Janet Atkins, was kind of a mirror of that person. She was early in her diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Her reaction was to get really depressed. Now, we know that this is a moving state of mind, that, if she'd joined a support group, she might have, a month later, she played tennis the day Jack Kevorkian took her life, or helped her take her own life. So, that woman, given a month, might have been in the same place as the woman mentioned on Lucy's show. And it's important to remember that, too. You don't want to jump on somebody with this at their lowest moment if there might be a higher moment to come.
Yeah, we got to take a break here. When we come back, there's a lot more to cover in the week's news. We're talking with Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show, Ryan Lindsay from Connecticut Public Radio, Mark Pasniokis from the Connecticut Mirror. We're on Facebook Live today, and this is The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news today with Colin McEnroe from The Colin McEnroe Show, Ryan Lindsay from Connecticut Public Radio and Guns in America, and Mark Pasniokis, Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror. March Madness is almost here. Colin was talking about it. He's going to have his big basketball show. And this year we've got a special treat because the XL Center in downtown Hartford is actually hosting the early rounds of the NCAA men's tournament. Of course, the women are going to play some games out at Stores, not as a number one seed, as a matter of fact. Maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. But here's Gino Auriemma talking about something that a lot of people have been talking about for years, the fact that the Hartford's XL Center, which is hosting these early round men's games, is kind of, well, at this point, it's kind of a dump. Here's Gino.
We're the number one team in the country year in and year out. We have the best program in the country year in and year out. So we deserve to play in the best facilities year in and year out. And other than Gamble Pavilion, we do not.
The former governor, Dan Malloy, Colin, made this case. The XL Center needs massive upgrades. We don't have a professional sports team there. The colleges are part-time tenants at best. Should we be spending big money to make sure that Gino has a palace to play in?
Well, no, not the way he puts it anyway. So look, the XL Center is in really bad shape. $100 million would kind of get it into something that vaguely resembles a modern sports arena. $250 million was the original Malloy administration idea of what it was going to take to really restore it to health. Elsewhere in that speech, Gino Auriemma said, don't ask me where the money's going to come from. I don't ask you to coach my basketball team, so don't ask me where the money's going to come from. And I just,
Shut up.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is, he should look at the state budget. He should see all the things that are going begging, all the important human concerns that are going begging because, in fact, Connecticut is broke, and then tell us why he needs $100 million or $250 million to feel good about himself. Look, I would love it if that were a better, more functioning stadium, but and I'm amazed that the NCAAs have actually come to it here in 2019. But I don't think those kinds of temper tantrums are pretty helpful. Are very helpful. And very quickly, let's remember, in the last set of disclosures, it turned out that the UConn women's basketball team, it's not that they don't make a lot of money. They lose money. Operationally, like all the big sports, they lose money. I think it was about $3.1 million a year.
The XL Center is a regional asset. It's at the end of its useful life without significant work. I will say, if you want to look at a public entity that is pretty sharp, look at CERTA, the quasi-public authority that runs the XL Center. They have a great plan on how to modernize that, and they've done it in stages. There's an expensive version. There's a less expensive version, and it shouldn't be seen as about some cockeyed way to try to bring back the NHL or to satisfy Gino Auriemma. It's a question of whether or not you want to have a regional asset in decent shape that can compete.
I have a couple thoughts or hot takes. One, I'd like to say that this is an incredibly first world problem. I think that people,
Amen.
$100 million for affordable housing, social programs, et cetera, could be much more impactful. I also think it's mindful to consider maybe looking at what happens to cities when they try and build these massive stadiums for Olympic bids, and then what happens to those thereafter. I know Atlanta is still using their 96 Olympic build, but again, if we're going to do this expansion, who is it actually going to benefit? How much is it going to cost? Will this create more jobs? And it's something that like maybe the folks in the North End and South End are not flocking even to this beer garden on Pratt Street. So,
Well, exactly. And you don't have to go more than about a block and a half from the XL Center to see a really nice baseball stadium that's filled every night that has resulted, as of right now, in no associated economic development around it.
And loses money for the city of Hartford every year. It sits on the books losing money for the city of Hartford. That often doesn't get reported by the sports columnists who are glowing about what an incredible success the Yard Goats are, which they are. But the city of Hartford is running in the red from that stadium.
Say very quickly,
the XL
Pat.
Center, it's not an expansion. It's in fact, it'll shrink the capacity somewhat. It's about maintaining a building. You have to decide whether you want it or not. Indoor arenas, they're easier to defend economically than all these other things. And it's not a choice between this and housing, because that ain't the way the budget works and that ain't the way the world works.
Okay, Paz, I'm going to come right back to you. A feat of strength, perhaps, for this week, or maybe a grumble, if you would?
No, and I don't know if it's easier. I just want to say goodbye to Ezekiel Santiago, who was one of the kindest, gentlest souls ever to serve in the Connecticut General Assembly. I'm so happy that the night before he died, very oddly, he got lost in the Capitol, and he came into the press room, and we all gave him a hard time, and we laughed, and that was the last time I saw him. He will be buried Friday. There's a memorial service at the Klein Memorial Auditorium. He was 45 years old, and he was a wonderful human being.
There's a beautiful tribute that I saw happen at the LOB, too.
Yes.
Thanks for that, Paz. How about you, Ryan?
I just want to shout out the students in New Zealand who've been performing hakas, Maori dances, to remember the victims of the shooting. I've seen some incredible videos of that traditional honoring of the dead, and I think it's really powerful, and it just made me think about, what would that look like for American students to honor the dead in a way that goes beyond a walkout or something like that. So shout out to them for doing that in this really incredible, tough time.
Thank you for that. Colin, how about you?
Mine now seems relatively frivolous after those last two, but somebody has to be frivolous. So tomorrow...
We're counting on you.
Tomorrow, number 14 seed in the March Madness draw, Yale, will be playing LSU. They've only ever played one other time. It was in 1969. It was in the heyday of LSU, at least the Pete Maravich heyday of LSU. They were playing in a tournament in Hawaii where Yale, which had a pretty wretched basketball program, was considered cannon fodder. In fact, the host team wanted to be sure they played Yale in the draw because they saw that as an easy step to victory. Well, it didn't work out that way. Yale somehow or other won game after game, and then December 30th, 1969, played LSU with the great Pete Maravich, who I always worshipped, and they won. They actually won that game. It's one of the great upsets, certainly in the history of Yale. It was 97-94, and I'm hoping very much that something similar happens on Thursday, although I kind of doubt it.
So this is a good one. So March Madness, a lot of things happening. Here's my little feat of strength today. If you take a look at the Connecticut Mirror, ctmirror.org, there's a really nice collaboration between Kathy Megan of the Mirror and our own Ryan Karen King, and they did a big story about the election of the first openly gay kid governor. And this is Ella Briggs. Maybe you've seen pictures of Ella, or maybe you've seen a video of Ella whenever she got this honor. But if you read through this, you're going to learn an awful lot about this young woman, and you're going to get a chance to see a really cool short video by Ryan Karen King. It really takes you inside, in a very quick way, the mind of an 11-year-old who's dealing with a little bit different life than maybe a lot of us had at 11 years old, and is just owning it out in public and talking to people and talking about how she just wants to make people happier. And I think that's a very good thing for the day. So check out ctmirror.org, and thanks to all the people who worked on that. Thanks also to Mark Pazniokis from the Connecticut Mirror. Thank you, Paz.
Thank you.
Thanks to Ryan Lindsay, who covers gun issues for Connecticut Public Radio. Thank you, Ryan.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much to Colin McEnroe, the host of The Colin McEnroe Show.
And thank you, Mr. Dankosky.
And thanks to Scott Brady, who produces our show. Our executive producer is Katie Tolarski. Kion Wolf is our technical producer. And thanks to Carlos Mejia for having all these cameras here for Facebook Live. Thanks also to the folks at CTN, the Connecticut Network. Thanks to intern Kayla Thomas. We'll be back next week with The Wheelhouse.